If you are interested in learning how to build a off-grid system to power a small cabin or even a large house, you're at the right place. Today we're going to be talking about all the components that you need, the advantages and disadvantages to different voltage setups, how it all works, how it all gets wired, how to fuse it. We're going to be going over all of that. Now, if you have $25,000 and you're really not an enthusiast, just skip this video. Go to Signature Solar, buy yourself a hybrid inverter, a couple of EG4 rack-mounted batteries, and be done with it. For the rest of us, for those who don't have unlimited funds, for those who are interested in actually learning how all these components work, stay tuned. I'm going to walk you through my setup, and we're going to talk about everything. What I liked, what I didn't like, what I would do differently, how to improve it, and hopefully this will inspire you to build your own system. So hang out, let's have some fun. So I'm going to do this in chapters. So if there's one thing you're interested in learning, you can just jump ahead to that. If you want an overview on everything, please, of course, watch the entire video. So I have a 24-volt system with 4 200 amp hour lithium iron phosphate batteries and a 6,000 watt split phase inverter. So system voltage is probably the best place to start. And frankly, I would not have picked a 24-volt system if I was to do this again. And I'll tell you why. Honestly, I didn't go with 48 volt because I was scared of it. I thought, you know, it's higher voltage, there's more chance of getting hurt. At the time, I didn't know anything about it. So I went with 24 volt just because I was a chicken. But I wouldn't do it again. I would do 48 volt. If you're going to build a large system, 48 volt just has so many more advantages. The components overall are going to be cheaper and more expandable once you actually build it. So if you're going to be building a large system, you know, something with a lot of battery storage and something that needs a lot of power coming out, I would strongly suggest you look into 48 volt system. And on the flip side of that, 12 volt systems for a large setup are just not worth doing. They're going to be cost prohibitive. They're going to be very difficult to upgrade. So if you're building a small system, 12 volt is good. If you're building a large system, look into 48 volt. You can get away with 24 volt. I mean, my system is perfectly fine, but there are advantages to building a 48 volt system. So really, that has to be your first question is, what are you building? How big of a system are you going to be building? How much storage are you going to need? How much are you going to be needing to power? So once you figure out that, you can really get into building, or you can really get into configuring and purchasing the components that are going to fit in that. So let's start by talking about inverters. I'm going to specifically talk about this inverter, the features that it has and why I chose it. And we're going to go over a couple different kind of inverters, how they're similar, how they're different, and that'll help you choose what inverter is best for you. Before we begin though, all of these inverters are what's known as pure sine wave inverters. You can also get what's called a modified sine wave inverter. They're cheaper. I don't like them. I don't recommend them. I don't use them. We're not going to be talking about them. So to start with, this is a 6,000 watt inverter, which means it can power 6,000 watts of devices continuously. It also is a low frequency inverter, which means it can power heavy inductive loads like a well pump, and it can do a huge amount of surge. So if you need something like that, you got to consider that. This also is split phase, which means it outputs electricity just like what you'd get from the grid. So I can actually run 240 devices off of this as well as 120. And this one actually wires directly from the back of this into my panel. It also has other features that I don't use, but that might be considerations for you. I'm completely off grid, so I don't need it, but this one will actually take AC power in, and it'll also let you start a generator remotely. So those are also features that you want to consider because they're popular features. I don't use them. I bought this one specifically because this is even though it's a new company, they have a good reputation for putting out quality devices, and this thing has been a beast. So if you have smaller needs, you could use something like this, and this is a Sun Gold Power. It's also split phase. It's also low frequency, but it can only output 3,000 watts. So if you had a smaller setup and you only needed to run, you know, like say you wanted to run an air conditioner or something that was heavy load but smaller, you know, you don't need to get the 6,000 watt. You could get the 3,000 watt. And both of these companies also make 12,000 watt versions. So if you needed to run a bigger load, you could actually upgrade and get a 12,000 watt version of either one. Both of them have similar features. They both will, do the remote start, take AC in. So they're really good for medium size systems. Now say you have a small system, but you still want a good inverter. Well, you could get this inverter. Now this is a 24 volt inverter, just like these other ones, but it can only do 1200 watts. So this, and it's not low frequency, it's a high frequency. So this one would be good if you just had a small, like a cabin, and you just wanted to run simple devices, a television, battery charger, stuff like that. And they all work the same way. They have DC in. This one can only take plug-ins, as in, outlets, where these two, again, you can actually hook directly up to your circuit breaker panel. So those are three different choices. They're similar because they're all 24 volt. These two are very similar, except this one doesn't output as much, and they can take heavy loads. So you have to just think about what are you going to be powering, and that'll help you decide what kind of inverter you're going to get. I would recommend you get the biggest and best inverter you can get, and also low frequency inverters. Even if you're not going to be running heavy inductive loads, they are better because they have that massive transformer. They last longer, and they're virtually indestructible. They just last forever. You can run them and run them and run them without any problems. That's kind of an overview of three different types of inverters, all 24 volt. Again, you could get these in 48 volt or 12 volt if you wanted to. But that's kind of an overview of inverters. Let's go on to the next one. So the next thing we're going to talk about is solar charge controllers. But before we jump into that, I want to mention something. Inverters can actually have charge controllers built into them. There are some that are all-in-ones. They're really cool if you just want to have a plug-and-play setup. So I'm not going to be talking about those because this is really for DIYers that want to build modular stuff. But if you want a simple setup, you can get an all-in-one inverter charge controller. They're very, very easy to use. You just add a couple of batteries and you're good to go. So this specifically is for people that want to learn all the components. Another thing is these inverters, especially this one, have web enabled, so you can look at them and monitor them from the web. But there are other ones out there like a Victron, really high-end stuff, that have very, very robust interfaces. So if you're looking for something like that where you can track your data and monitor stuff and have a really cool GUIs and stuff like that, you might want to consider bumping up to something like a Victron or something on the higher end, because they are very robust, where these really aren't designed to do that. So now let's jump into charge controllers. So now we're at charge controllers. And like I said at the end of the inverter part, you can actually get an all-in-one charge controller inverter that does everything. They're really cool, they're plug and play, they're simple to install. If you get a higher end one like a Victron, you've got cloud integration, you've got data collection, you've got all sorts of analytics, you can track all sorts of cool things. I didn't get that because I don't need those features and I wanted to have redundancy. But first let's talk about what a charge controller actually does. So this is the step between your solar panels and your system. So this is where the solar panel, this is where the solar energy comes in, and then it's regulated into your system. So you can actually control how your batteries are charged, how high you want them charged, how you can set different parameters to your batteries. You can do all sorts of things through this unit. Now, as you can see, mine are mounted high, so you don't actually have to use the unit. You can, on mine, you can actually use these controllers to monitor and set your charging parameters to your battery. So back to my setup. I use 4 because I want redundancy. I'm remote, so if something goes down, I still want to have some sort of solar energy coming in. Or if I had an all-in-one, if something went down, I'd be dead in the water. That's why I have a backup inverter in case my main inverter goes down. I don't have to wait 2 weeks or 3 weeks and not have any power. So that's why I have redundancy. So you can have multiple, you can have one. You can do it however you want. The key to remember is the sizing to your system. And that's where voltage comes into that's where the system voltage comes into it. This one at 24 volt can actually control 1,000 watts of solar panels, but at 12 volts it can only do 500, so it's cut in half. So I would highly recommend you get an MPPT style charge controller. There are other types of charge controllers out there, but they're just not as effective or efficient. With these, it'll maximize your solar energy coming in. It'll take the voltage and the amps and make sure the most amount of energy is getting into your system. So I highly recommend these, and also make sure that you match your charge controller to your system. That's a quick overview of charge controllers. Now let's jump into batteries. So let's look at a practical example. My setup. So I have 4 200 amp hour lithium iron phosphate batteries that are 24 volts each. And I made them out of these 3.2 volt lithium iron phosphate cells. But you don't have to do it this way. Like I was saying, you could get rack mounted batteries. You could get store-bought batteries like an SOK or a Lead Time or a Power Queen, or 1,000 different types. Then you can put together them parallel or series, just depending on what your needs are. So that's where you have to figure out, what are your needs? What are you going to be powering? How long do you need to store that energy? And then from there you can figure out what kind of batteries you're going to need. Do you want to make them yourself? Do you need to have rack mounted? Can you get off the shelf batteries? And then just make those decisions. So now let's talk about putting it all together. Wiring, fusing, circuit breakers, monitoring, battery switches, all the components that you're going to need. So to begin with, the first and most important thing you're going to need to know is the wire. You're going to have to properly wire your setup. And that just depends on how many amps are going to be going through your system as far as what you get. But you're going to have to learn the difference between 2 gauge and 2 watt. Figure out the maximum amount of amperage that's going to go through your system and properly wire it. You're also probably going to have to learn how to make your own wires, because you're not going to be able to find stuff off the shelf. You're going to have to get raw wire and lugs and learn how to make them. And it's not difficult. I have videos on it. It's not very difficult to do. The second thing you're going to have to do is fuse everything. And at minimum, you're going to need a fuse between your battery bank and the rest of your system. The bare minimum. And this is a popular way to do it. This is an A&L fuse. Again, you want to make sure your fuse matches the size of your system. If you have a fuse too small, it's always going to blow. If you have a fuse too big, it's never going to do anything. So these are very popular and they're perfectly fine. I used them for a long time. On my system now, though, I actually use Class T fuses, which are the best way to fuse your system. And I highly recommend you look into getting these. They're more expensive, and sometimes these are hard to find. That's why I have a backup. But they are the best way to fuse your system. In addition to that, on my system, because my batteries are in parallel, I put a terminal fuse, one of these MRBF fuses, on each battery in my battery bank. That way, if there's a failure in the battery bank, the fuse will catch any potential problems. So this is not something you need to do if you have stuff in series, but if you have stuff in parallel, you definitely want to put these on there. And at minimum, you want to have some sort of fusing between your battery bank and the rest of your system. Now let's talk about circuit breakers. On my system, I have low amperage circuit breakers, much like this, on my charge controllers coming in and coming out. So the solar panels, and the solar panels are also fused outside the building, but the energy coming in to the charge controller and going out can be separated by a fuse. I would recommend you use Busman fuses, or at minimum these type of fuses, because one thing I've noticed about fuses, and this kind of drives me crazy, is these cheap fuses that you get on Amazon, like this for example, says 150 amps, but it's the exact same size as this one that is 50 amps. So there's no possible way this thing is actually going to do 50 amps. So you got to be careful. For example, here is the 250 amp that I use in my system, and you can see the terminals are bigger, it's heavier, there's a lot more copper in there. So these circuit breakers that say they're high amperage, that are cheap looking and lightweight and have small lugs on them, don't use them. Get Busman or equivalent, something good. You don't want to use cheap circuit breakers. Another thing you want to get is heavy duty bus bars, and you want to make sure your bus bar matches your system. This bus bar is rated for 250 amps, so it can handle anything that's in my system. Another thing you're going to want to do is to monitor your system. Now, you can monitor it a variety of different ways. There are Bluetooth apps on most batteries now. If you have a nice setup like a Victron or something that is web enabled, you can monitor things remotely. You can see everything that's going on. You can also add a Hall effect sensor. This just goes over the wire, and then you just hook these wires up to the negative and the positive. This goes over your system wire on your negative side, and then you can actually monitor the energy as it moves around your system. Another way, and which is probably the most popular way, is to use a shunt. And this just interrupts the negative side, and then you can monitor everything from here, so you can see what's coming in and what's going out. And again, on mine, I use my MT50s to monitor what's going on with my batteries, and then I just use the monitor and the web-enabled part on my inverter, and it tells me what's going through the inverter. So I don't have a shunt on mine, but you're going to definitely need a way to monitor your system. You're going to want to protect your system. So another thing you can do is put in a battery switch. So on your battery bank, you have your main fuse coming out. This would go after that, and you could actually turn off your battery and separate it, so you could do maintenance or do stuff to your system. If you do use this and you have a setup like mine where you have charge controllers, you got to make sure you turn off your solar energy to your charge controllers before you turn off your battery, or you will cause a lot of problems. But you definitely want to protect your system, separate your system, fuse your system, and properly size the wire of your system. These are really important parts of your system. It'll keep you safe, and it'll make your system run the most efficient way it possibly can. So while this is just an intro to how to do a setup, I thought I would walk you through the general process for the wiring. And I'm going to use mine as an example. So as I talked about, I have 4 batteries that are in parallel. I have a bus bar for the negative here. I have a bus bar for the positive there. I have my battery hooked up on one end there on the positive, and over here I have the negative connected, so the load is pretty uniform through my batteries. What you don't want to do is have your positive here, your negative here, and then have all your other batteries down here, because these batteries down here are just not going to be used as much. They're going to not get charged as much, they're not going to discharge as much, and this battery is going to do all the work. So you definitely want to have the power flow through your entire setup. Now, these are homemade bus bars, of course. You could use a store-bought bus bar, but I had a bunch of copper line around, so I just built my own bus bars. They are rated to take the amperage that I need. So again, you just want to make sure that everything is rated properly. And also, these wires are the same gauge as the main wire. Yeah, that's another thing. Even though there won't be necessarily as much energy running through this, you got to be safe. And like I talked about before, you can see there is the terminal fuse on each one of my batteries, just as extra precaution. So that's the battery bank. The battery bank on the negative side just comes up to this bus bar, and then the inverter is wired to that bus bar. And then on this side, you can see that the negative goes back into here, connects to this bus bar, and that bus bar just distributes out to my 4 charge controllers. So, and then on the positive side, I have a heavy gauge wire going from my bus bar to my Class T fuse. The Class T fuse is the separates the bus bar from the general system, so if there's a problem, that'll shut everything down. And then I have this wire, the positive wire goes here. This is just an extra thing I have. It's not required, but I just added an extra circuit breaker, and then from there it goes into the positive side of my inverter. Come back over here, Class T on that side goes out to this bus bar, which distributes the positive side of my charge controllers, and I can physically separate any charge controller that I want if I want to do maintenance or repair something or just to turn something off. These over here are my circuit breakers that go out to the solar panels, so I can turn off each one of them coming in. And like I mentioned before, if you are going to turn off your battery, you're going to want to turn off your solar energy coming in first. Otherwise, you'll send solar energy into a charge controller that's turned off and you could fry it. So you don't want to do that. So I have 1, 2, come over here is 3, 4. So I have 4 arrays, and that controls the solar energy coming in to the 4 arrays. And then again, those are the 4 circuit breakers that I can turn off the energy coming into the system. So the wiring is not very complicated. Anybody with studies up on this a little bit could wire it. The key to remember is that you have to properly wire everything, and you're going to want to properly fuse everything. So of course it all starts with the solar panels. And there's a lot of different types of solar panels you can get out there. One thing you're going to have to do though is make sure the voltage of your solar panels matches the voltage of your system. Also, look into buying used panels. I bought some used 250 watt solar panels from Suntan Solar a few years ago, and they work great. So if you're on a budget, that could be a really good solution for you. So that's an overview of my setup, and hopefully this inspires you to start your own setup. My setup is constantly changing. Every couple of weeks I change something, add something, learn something. So this is fun hobby. I would highly recommend you get into this at some level. You can start small, you can start with a battery, you can start with an inverter, you can start with a charge controller, and build up from there. I would recommend though that you think about the future and plan to make sure that whatever you buy doesn't become obsolete, but have fun with this. And if you built a system out there, I'd love to hear your input. Leave a comment below, and as always, like, share, subscribe, and hit that notification bell, and I will talk to you guys later.